CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Juliet Mann.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Russia's Gazprom halts gas deliveries to Europe at short notice, claiming more maintenance is needed on the Nord Stream pipeline.
Counting the costs. European inflation sets a new high as record energy costs drive up prices.
One of the most influential political figures of the 20th century. Tributes are paid to Mikhail Gorbachev, who's died aged 91.
EU foreign ministers agree to suspend a visa deal with Russia, but some states say it doesn't go far enough.
And delegates arrive from around the world for China's International Fair for Trade and Services, which has just opened in Beijing.
Russia has stopped gas flows via Europe's key supply route, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Moscow says it's due to maintenance issues, but European governments fear the outage could be extended.
Supplies were already at about 20% capacity, with Russia blaming Western sanctions. The shutdown comes as Europe tries to stockpile energy ahead of the winter. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Stuart Smith, who's in Moscow. So, Stuart, Russia's saying this is just a temporary technical shutdown, and it's hit out at Germany for what it describes as destroying energy relations.
Yep, that's right, and it shows how critical the gas situation is between Russia and Europe at the moment, because this is one turbine going down for maintenance on one of 4 pipelines, and yet it's practically halted all deliveries of Russian gas directly to Europe, because right now the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is the only one running. The other 4 either unusable due to the so-called special military operation in Ukraine or due to Russian sanctions. And then within the Nord Stream 1 pipeline itself, these 5 other turbines that should be there to provide extra boost for that gas. The reason it's only running at 20%, well, Russia says it cannot get those turbines back because of European Union and Canadian sanctions. Now, Canada, the European Union and the UK say they provided assurances to Gazprom that they can bring these turbines back in without violating sanctions. Gazprom says it doesn't have the assurances it needs, and so down again for 3 days this time, the expected timeline. 1,000 hours of operation of one turbine, Gazprom says, means that the turbine must be inspected, and that's why this has to go down. It says it will, once making sure the turbine is in good condition, resume pumping at that 20% level. But if it's not, that could mean the end of gas exports from Russia to Europe via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and that's making countries very nervous, although there are good signs that the European Union is getting close to fulfilling its gas storage requirements.
And Stuart, we've seen record profits for Gazprom despite Western sanctions.
Yes, and some analysts are also noting that because of these record profits, if Russia did decide, or if it says due to technical issues it must stop exporting gas, then it would be perfectly fine in terms of its current account balance, because indeed Gazprom is making record profits because of the very high gas prices, and the board of directors say that it's going to pay out around $20 billion in dividends to shareholders because of these record profits. One of the directors said the results of the first half of the year are very, very, very good, and record dividends will be paid. This is Gazprom is the state-owned energy exporter in Russia, and some of these profits will end up back in Russia's pocket with a new windfall tax that has been imposed by the Russian government earlier this year.
Stuart, thank you very much. That's our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
As European countries scramble to build up energy reserves ahead of winter, some are hoping to look close to home for their gas supply. Our correspondent Alex Cadier reports from the Netherlands.
The race to tackle the energy crisis and replace gas supplies from Russia is already underway. European governments are once again accusing Moscow of weaponizing its gas supplies after Russian company Gazprom announced it would cut gas to Western Europe because of maintenance to the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Facing volatility from Russia, European governments may be tempted to tap into one of the largest natural gas fields in the world, the Groningen gas field in the north of the Netherlands. The problem is earthquakes linked to gas extraction in the region have been devastating to local communities, with many houses in the area needing to be torn down. 8 years ago, an earthquake collapsed the roof of Henrik's barn, and cracks have appeared in the walls in and around his home.
Yeah, and you can see that we have here also a crack from the earthquakes. Now 7-8 years ago, then it began. But every year the crack is a little bit wider. So yeah, the building is still vibrating. It's not the damage goes further and further.
The Dutch government has pledged to close the field this year, but now The Hague is under pressure to push back that deadline.
The Dutch government faces quite a serious dilemma with Groningen gas field because it has at least three severe obstacles. First one is obviously the long-term contracts with German companies that run from long time ago until at least 2030s. And the second one is obviously the energy crisis that has started a year ago. And the third one is the conventional war in Europe that was caused by the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Many residents like Henrik dealing with the local impact of the earthquakes now find themselves facing greater obstacles to close the field. Despite years of court cases and appealing to authorities for help, the Dutch government only installed a temporary safety structure in Henrik's barn, even though the building's problems keep getting worse. Henrik's case is far from unique. The last earthquake to happen here in Overschild, just outside of Groningen, was in the last few weeks. Now, over the years, residents have seen firsthand how serious the consequences can be. 80% of the houses here need to be rebuilt. Now, the energy crisis may be a global problem, but its consequences are being felt very severely locally here in Holland. Alex Cadier, CGTN, Overschild, Holland.
Inflation in the Eurozone has set a record high, hitting 9.1% in August. Soaring energy costs were the driving force behind the rise, as our correspondent Ross Cullen reports from Paris.
Eurozone inflation has jumped to another record-breaking high, approaching double-digit territory. The Statistical Office of the European Union says it was at 9.1% in August, up from 8.9% in July. The breakdown for this month's figures show that, unsurprisingly, energy accounted for the highest annual rate change from August 2021, followed by food, alcohol and tobacco, industrial goods and services. The European Central Bank has already raised interest rates, and it will have to decide if it wants to continue with that policy or instead try to encourage growth through a financial stimulus, but that could fuel further price rises. As gas supplies from Russia are interrupted or halted completely, the continent has also been sweating through a severe drought and successive heat waves, piling pressure on power plants. Now, the pain at checkouts and fuel pumps for European consumers is likely to continue, with EU leaders warning of a particularly difficult winter ahead. EU member states are rushing to try to fill gas reserves to see the public through the colder months when lighting and heating are critical. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Let's talk to Klaus Vistenson. He's the chief Eurozone economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics. And thanks for coming on the programme. So it looks like high costs are filtering right through the entire economy. Food, energy, non-energy services. That's a big concern.
Indeed, and you know, it'll probably get worse before it gets better. You know, Eurozone inflation is not accelerating anymore, but it remains very high. We think it will remain high. It'll probably go a little bit higher still. We think headline inflation could hit 10% in September. Core inflation is probably going to increase further. So, you know, it's looking ahead to next week's ECB meeting. You know, we now look for a 75 basis points hike, which I suspect is now the consensus. So, yeah, it's still quite bad out there. You know, inflation numbers are high and policy is tightening.
You talk about your expectations for what the European Central Bank will do next week, but you know, tackle inflation, push up the cost of borrowing. They're really in a tricky spot here, aren't they?
Very much so. You know, what we have in the Eurozone now is sort of very close to sort of a form of stagflation, right? You have slowing growth, but inflation remains high. That's a very difficult situation for monetary policymakers. Things will get better towards the end of the year into 2023, but so right now, you know, all eyes are on inflation. The European Central Bank really has to focus on inflation, and therefore that's why they will continue to raise interest rates.
Well, considering, too, soaring energy prices, we're on the fast track to recession, aren't we?
Probably so. We think the Eurozone is now in a technical recession, a relatively shallow recession, but a recession all the same. We're hoping that the labor market remains resilient. We still believe that. But yes, we think that GDP in the Eurozone is now falling.
And what about labour markets? Because all across the Eurozone, they're a worry too.
Yeah, I mean, up until now, the labor market has remained relatively resilient, even as sentiment has taken a hit and, uncertainty has increased after the war in Ukraine. The labor market has been resilient. We think that continues. But in Germany, we're already seeing signs of rising unemployment. And we think that probably continues in some of the other European economies in the second half of the year. But overall, we're still quite upbeat on the labor market, relatively speaking, even as output falls.
You've given us those words of doom: stagflation, technical recession. If we do slip into a formal recession, is it going to be a hard landing?
I mean, I suppose when you have a recession and interest rates are going up, I mean, that is, I suppose, the definition of a hard landing. We think the economy will rebound pretty quickly next year. I mean, in a way, what the Eurozone economy is living and going through now is a shock. The war is a shock. The curtailment of Russian energy supply is a shock. But on the flip side of that, the economy will adjust eventually, and then we think there's foundation for growth. But it'll be difficult in the next 3 to 6 months for sure, because winter is coming literally, and therefore you could see further rise in gas prices, especially if you get cold snaps. So it'll be difficult, and for both consumers and firms.
Winter is indeed coming. Klaus Wistensen at Pantheon Macroeconomics, thank you very much.
Still ahead here on CGTN. Why American regulators may have these US-listed Chinese companies in their sights for an audit. We'll be live in New York next.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
It's a major date in the Chinese business calendar. The 2022 China International Fair for Trade in Services has opened in Beijing. It comes as the sector looks to bounce back after the COVID pandemic. CGTN's Yo Yang takes a look at what visitors can expect.
The annual China International Fair for Trading Services, as well as the Global Trading Services Summit, kick off today at China National Convention Center in Beijing. China's President Xi Jinping sent a congratulatory letter to the event. He said China will further deepen its opening up and call on the international society to enhance coordination and cooperation in the face of the challenges brought by the coronavirus pandemic. This year, the theme of the event is Cooperate for Better Development, Innovate for Greener Future. For the highlights of these activities, I would like to use 3 words to describe them. They are larger, greener and higher technology. First, As the friend circle of this event has expanded, a total of 65 countries and international organizations are taking part, and over 1,400 enterprises have registered for the gathering, with an increase of over 13% compared with last year. And 10 countries, including the United Arab Emirates, Switzerland, Italy and Australia, are taking part for the first time. The United Arab Emirates will be the guest of honor at these activities. They're showcasing products for aviation services, financial services, advanced manufacturing and cultural services of diversified economy. Meanwhile, this year, for the first time, a thematic exhibition on environmental services has been added to the grand gathering, which is focusing on low-carbon energy, carbon neutrality, as well as green development. And all booths at the thematic exhibition on environmental services have been reserved by exhibitors, of which Fortune Global 500 companies and industry-leading enterprises account for more than 30%. The sector aligns with China's dual carbon goals and the rapid development trend and global needs in environmental services. And this year, we also expect some extraordinary cutting-edge technologies, such as virtual reality and metaverse. The 2022 activities will be held partly online due to COVID-19 pandemic. The exhibition will run through September 5th, and 7 summit forums, as well as over 100 thematic gatherings, can be expected. Yu Yang, CGTN, Beijing.
Reuters is reporting that US regulators have selected major US-listed Chinese companies for audit inspection, with e-commerce giants Alibaba and JD.com among those chosen. It follows last week's landmark deal between Beijing and Washington, which allows US authorities to vet company accounts on the Chinese mainland and Hong Kong. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. So, John, this is to do with last week's deal, then?
Yes, we broke it pretty much on our program on Friday. I remember, Juliet and Robin, we did. And it's funny, you know, because Baidu, which I always think of as China's Google, whenever I'm in China, I Google via Baidu, if you see what I mean. They gave us our earnings yesterday, and I was reporting on them, and they were pretty good. The earnings were okay. They couldn't really overcome a slight revenue dip, although their cloud business was good. But there was also a line in there saying they can't overcome the audit threat. I think, well, that's very weird. What's that all about then? Because we had that deal last Friday, and their shares were down 7% last night, but they're up 5% now. And now, of course, it's clear what was going on, because clearly overnight Reuters began reporting that the auditors from America, who are now going to go to China under this deal, have selected 3 companies, and one of them isn't Baidu. But boy, are they going for the big ones. They're going for Baba, JD.com, Jingdong.com, and Yum China. Now, in case you don't know about Yum China, there's Yum brands here in America. Yum China is in charge of those brands in China and parts of Asia. Based in Shanghai, they are in charge of KFC, or Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, have about 10,000 restaurants. And you're absolutely right. This is all part of that deal inked between Beijing and Washington last Friday. And American auditors, for the very first time, are going to be allowed to travel in September to Beijing and audit Chinese ADRs that trade here. And if you remember, on Friday, I told you Gary Gensler, who's the head of the leading regulator, the SEC, was very buoyant about this. This has been 20 years in the making, this deal, and they finally got it signed last Friday. And he says he has very friendly relationships with the Ministry of Finance in Beijing and China's Securities Regulatory Commission as well. But this does come with a warning. He says the auditors will go over later in September. We should know by December whether it's all working. He says it's a very detailed, very specific agreement. But he says if it doesn't work out, if things don't work out the way they should, then the delisting of Chinese companies on the New York exchanges may be back on the agenda in early 2023. So let's hope that doesn't happen. I mean, everyone's very optimistic at the moment. Robin and Juliet?
Also, John, the car maker Toyota is charging towards batteries.
Yeah. Well, Toyota's history in America is such a fascinating one. You know, they came to Hollywood, California to sell cars in 1957. They got their first factory in Kentucky, in Georgetown, in 1984, and they were very, very unwelcome here. People used to say, oh, did I key your car? Sorry about that, it's a Toyota. A lot of that going on. They were very, very unwelcome, and now they are employing lots and lots of Americans. Now, they didn't base themselves in Detroit because Detroit didn't want them there, but there's a very fast road called Route 23 that brings spare parts and things all the way down to the south of the country, in the Gulf states, where Toyota is based. They have 3 factories in Kentucky, 1 in Texas, and actually now 3 in Indiana, which is to the north But the point about today's story is that Toyota is expanding a factory that it had planned to build in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is on the East Coast. And it's a $3.8 billion investment. It was much less than that, but they bumped it up because of all the incentives the local government are offering there. They're going to make a battery plant for hybrid cars. Eventually, the whole thing will employ about 1,700 people, but today's news adds another 350. Toyota says this is because of battery demand in the US, particularly for hybrids and electric vehicles. But I have to caution you, I did this yesterday, and oh, by the way, Panasonic, the Japanese company, is going to be their partner. They also partner with Tesla, by the way. But I have to caution you, survey after survey after survey suggests that only 1/3 of Americans are even interested or even maybe one day thinking about an electric vehicle. Now, we have a survey from Consumer Reports, which is a bit like Which in the UK. You know, they test things. Consumer Reports in July reported that people that were about to buy cars at that moment in July, only 14% of them were thinking of going for an EV, and that was up from about 3% 2 years ago before the pandemic set in. So, you know, I mean, it's clearly a major investment from Toyota. But we are, in America anyway, a long way from being swamped and overrun by electric vehicles. It's a relatively small percentage here still.
John, thanks for that. Good to talk to you. Our correspondent John Terrace in New York.
The Chinese tech giant NetEase has marked its first major push into Europe with the takeover of Star Wars game maker Quantic Dream. NetEase announced it had acquired the French game developer, which becomes the Chinese firm's first gaming studio in Europe. It also signals a move into the games console market, with NetEase having previously focused on mobile apps.
Rapid rises in the cost of food in the UK has pushed August shop price inflation to its highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Prices rose by 5.1% as food producers passed on increasing costs from the war in Ukraine to consumers.
Cruise ship company Royal Caribbean says it will team up with Elon Musk's rocket company SpaceX to use its Starlink system to offer faster internet at sea. Royal Caribbean says the partnership, utilising Starlink's large network of orbiting satellites, should allow more high-width bandwidth activities like video streaming on its ships, where connection can be poor.
The global art market is turning to Asia to attract new collectors, and Singapore is fast becoming a popular destination for galleries.
Recognising its potential, international auction house Sotheby's has held a major sale there for the first time in 15 years. Our correspondent Miro Liu reports.
Sold. Well done at $3 million too.
Exceeding pre-sale expectations, Sotheby's sold artwork worth $17.5 million in its first physical auction in Singapore in 15 years. Nearly half of the pieces were sold at prices higher than originally estimated. Amongst the 50 pieces under the hammer, you have artworks from Southeast Asian artists depicting daily life in this part of the world. You also have works from famous Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama, as well as 2 pieces from Chinese masters such as Zhu Dequn and Zhao Wuji. The variety of the collection highlights the cosmopolitan nature of the buyers in Singapore and the region. Sotheby's says that buyers from Singapore were active globally across categories last year. Demand from Southeast Asian collectors, particularly those from Singapore, has increased by almost 75% in the last 5 years.
Historically, we've only done auctions out of Hong Kong. So as we look at the landscape, I think Singapore features a lot of positives for our business. It has a very established, family office base, a favorable tax environment, and we've seen some positive momentum as relates to culture and the arts.
Nin Chong and her father, Chong Huai Seng, are veterans of the art world. Apart from being ardent collectors themselves, they operate a private art gallery as well as an art advisory for family offices. Nin and fellow art collectors are excited by Sotheby's return as it shows confidence in Southeast Asia's growing art market.
I see this trend where there are now nodes of activity in the key capitals in the various Southeast Asian markets. So, for example, we see local art fairs becoming really a key gathering point for art business. There's this network that has developed over the last 5 years, I would say, of curators, scholarship, collectors, patronage. And I think that's something that's very encouraging to see.
Nin adds that while Singapore has the will and infrastructure to build an art ecosystem, what it lacks is private patronage and corporate support for ground-up arts initiatives. Despite this, she believes that the influx of family offices and the success of the Sotheby's auction will encourage more auction houses to host sales here and pave the way for the city-state to become a thriving art hub. Mira Lu, CGTN, Singapore.
Still ahead here on CGTN. The EU decides to make it harder and more expensive for Russians to get travel visas because of the war in Ukraine.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Juliet Mann and me, Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. Russia's Gazprom halts gas deliveries to Europe at short notice, claiming more maintenance is needed on the Nord Stream pipeline.
And counting the cost, Eurozone inflation sets a new high as record energy costs drive up prices.
One of the most influential political figures of the 20th century, Mikhail Gorbachev, has died at the age of 91.
He was the last leader of the Soviet Union and helped end the Cold War without bloodshed. China has expressed condolences, saying Gorbachev made positive contributions to the normalization of relations between China and the Soviet Union.
US President Joe Biden says Gorbachev was a man of remarkable vision, while United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says he changed the course of history. Our correspondent Siobhan McCall reports.
He was a man who recast the world order, and yet was never far from the people within it. Mikhail Gorbachev was born to poor farmers, but in this peasant boy, the regime had met its match. Determined and ambitious, Gorbachev clawed his way to university and rose up the communist ranks. When Soviet leaders met him in Crimea, they saw the talent and 7 years later he was leader. Faced with economic crisis, Gorbachev launched his perestroika and glasnost reforms, paving the way for free speech, democracy and entrepreneurship. It set in motion events that he did not predict. When the Berlin Wall fell, he refused to send in troops. Instead, he promised peace and human rights, signing a historic nuclear disarmament treaty with the US. His friend Pavel Palaschenko was there through it all.
He was able to change, working with Reagan, Bush, Thatcher, Kohl within just a few years. So it's that legacy that you know, optimism can work, that hard work can work, that it can produce results. That, I think, is his main legacy.
But his economic reforms at home foundered. His critics accused him of only pursuing democracy to get Western money. When Soviet countries began declaring independence, he knew he had to step down.
Я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР.
С одной стороны, сами же люди, 80-е годы.
On the one hand, people in the 80s saw an increasing crisis in a system that was not working. But when Gorbachev tried to reform it and talked about the problems, they blamed their suffering, their shock at the collapse, on him. Unfortunately, to a large extent, that opinion has stuck. So the image of Gorbachev on average in Russian society is generally negative, and in my opinion, that's undeserved.
Mikhail Gorbachev was a hero to the West.
I want to say hello to you.
But in Russia, some blame him for the country's collapse into capitalist chaos in the 90s. Throughout it all, he kept his core belief: peace and freedom for everyone. And for a man who made so much history, that was one idea that he hoped would endure.
Speaking to me earlier, the former president of Romania said the Soviet leader had a unique place in the history of the 20th century.
Was the one liberating the countries from the control of Soviet Union, was the one generating the reunification of Germany, was the one respecting the wishes of the nations and not imposing with the army the Kremlin's ideology. Is the hero of the 20th century.
Our correspondent Michael Voss is here with us now. And Michael, we have to start with this. You actually met Mikhail Gorbachev. What were your impressions of him? What was he like?
Well, I was a Moscow correspondent for the last 2 years of Gorbachev, the coup, and then the start of Yeltsin. I heard many of his speeches. I actually interviewed him a few years after he left power. One of the things we discussed was the lack of economic change in Russia and why he hadn't pushed that further. And he said his priority at the time was to reform the system from within, and that he needed public support for that. And had he pushed through draconian economic reforms, he wouldn't have got that. I think he came across as a very human leader. He tried to bring change by persuasion, not the iron fist, if you like. He was also a devout family man. He was devastated when his wife Raisa died after 46 years of marriage, and you somehow felt perhaps he wasn't quite the same man after that.
But tributes have been coming in from all over the world.
Yes, they have. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, said he changed the course of history. Britain's outgoing Prime Minister spoke of admired his courage and integrity, while US President Joe Biden called him a rare leader who had the imagination to see that a different future was possible. You mentioned earlier on that China had sent their condolences, saying he'd made positive contributions to the normalization of relations. He was the first Soviet leader in 30 years to visit Beijing. And then President Putin offered his deepest condolences, saying Gorbachev understood that reforms were necessary. But after that, Putin's spokesman said that Gorbachev was wrong to believe in the internal romance with the West.
So, by all measures, a hugely influential figure on the world stage. What has Mikhail Gorbachev's legacy been?
Well, as you say, he was one of the key political leaders of the 20th century, widely respected in the West for ending the Cold War. But really, a lot of people in Russia blamed him for the collapse of the Soviet Union, this vast empire that took in parts of Asia and the European Union. And obviously, you know, in the past, President Putin had described this as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. I mean, he came to power in 1985, the youngest leader, and he set out with glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. As a young correspondent in Moscow, I was able to travel to places and interview people that would have been impossible in the past. Foreign policy terms, nuclear arms deals with reduction deals with the US. He ended the war in Afghanistan, pulled his troops out there, and he didn't intervene militarily when the country's Warsaw Pact neighbors changed their governments and left the alliance. But it was mixed opinions in Russia. Some said he was not going far or fast enough, particularly with the economy. Others said he'd gone too far, too fast, hence the coup. In power, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for improving East-West relations, but it's still unclear whether Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev will receive a state funeral in Moscow.
Well, Yeltsin had one. But anyway, for you, what a time to be a reporter.
It really was, yes.
Michael Voss, thank you. Inspectors from the UN's nuclear watchdog are in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, where they'll assess the embattled power plant.
The team from the International Atomic Energy Agency are expected to arrive at the nuclear facility, Europe's largest, on Thursday. For weeks, Kiev and Moscow have accused each other of shelling the plant, raising fears of a possible nuclear disaster. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Sergio Olmos, who's in Zaporizhia. Sergio, what's happening there today?
Well, you can see the UN cars lined up right behind me there. The inspectors are here. They've arrived in Zaporizhia. The nuclear power plant in Enerhodar is about 35 miles away geographically. It's about a 2-hour car ride. They would need to cross into Russian-occupied territory. This is Ukrainian-held territory, the city of Zaporizhia. They have settled in for the night in a hotel. After a long road trip from Kyiv, about 550 kilometers away, we've seen them stowing their gear. One of them was wearing body armor. So indeed, the inspectors coming not just with radiological, suits to prepare themselves, but actually wearing body armor. As Rafael Grossi says, they are going into a war zone. Let's hear a little bit from Rafael Grossi himself.
These operations are very complex operations. We are going to a war zone. We are going to occupy territory, and this requires the explicit guarantees from not only from the Russian Federation, also from the Republic of Ukraine, and we have been able to secure that.
And the fighting continues, of course. What's the latest on the Ukrainian pushback in the city of Kherson?
Well, Ukraine says it's had some success in its counteroffensive. Of course, that counteroffensive began 2 days ago, and we don't know many details. There is a kind of media blackout at the moment in that region. Reporters aren't allowed to travel there and to the front lines, so we have to rely on what Ukrainian officials say and what Russian state media say is happening on their side. We know that Ukraine has captured 4 villages, according to reporting in CNN. They've had success in 3 other villages, according to Ukrainian officials today. We know that Russian state media has said that there's been explosions in the Kherson region, power outages, some residents have seen water supply fluctuate. We know that a Kremlin spokesperson has said that Ukraine's counteroffensive, so-called offensive, has not done well, that they've pushed them back, that Ukraine has taken significant losses. Ukraine has not really countered with anything there. Ukraine is kind of keeping mum on the subject of exactly what villages it's attacking, losses it's incurring. We know that Ukraine officials have been trying to temper expectations about this counteroffensive that they've launched before the winter. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky saying that he says that Russian troops should flee while they can, but other than that, Ukrainian officials are really keeping a tight-lipped about anything going on in the Kherson region. We know of explosions and bridges, railway links being hit, but we aren't really getting many details about what specific villages have been captured, and that from Ukrainian officials is because of operational security. They want to kind of keep this as tight-lipped as they can. So we're still learning more, but definitely that offensive has seemed to have kicked off.
Sergio, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, Sergio Olmos, in Zaporizhia.
The European Union will suspend a visa agreement with Russia, making it harder and more costly for Russian citizens to enter the bloc. But member states remain divided over imposing a blanket ban. The announcement comes after a second day of talks between EU foreign ministers in Prague. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray. He's in Budapest. Trent, an agreement's been made. So what's been said?
Yeah, Juliet, that's right. An agreement which will make areas like this one here in central Budapest very busy with tourists over the summer. A lot more difficult now for Russian tourists to come and visit, not just here, but right across the bloc. And that is because, as you say, this deal from 2007, which effectively made the visa process quite simple for Russian citizens to come to the EU, well, that has now been torn up by the European Union. And effectively what that means is there'll be no preferential treatment anymore. It'll cost more to get a visa, the application will take longer, and that is because, in the words of Joseph Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, Russians have been travelling to the EU for leisure and shopping as if there is no war going on in Ukraine. This cannot be business as usual. So that is why you are seeing these steps by the EU. But, and it's a big but, it is worth noting this is not what several EU countries wanted. In fact, those countries up in the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, as well as Finland and Poland, they wanted just a blanket travel ban completely for the shutter doors to be rolled up to Russian tourists entirely. France and Germany argued against that, saying we shouldn't be punishing ordinary Russian citizens for the actions of their government. So what you've effectively got here is a bit of a compromise to try and get the two sides to be happy with some sort of action. But of course, in many ways, it has upset those countries in the far east of Europe who did want more.
Well, you talk of a compromise, but there's been a threat of unilateral action from the 5 Eastern Bloc members if no blanket ban was agreed. So what happens next?
Yeah, well, they haven't got the blanket ban across the entire European Union, but that doesn't stop them acting unilaterally, and that is because when it comes to borders and national security, EU law doesn't trump the domestic law of a member state. And when you think about those 5 countries that we're discussing, what they all have in common is that they, of course, border Russia. And with that EU flight ban, effectively, for Russian aeroplanes to come into the EU, what it means is if that, say, Hungary or Spain or Italy issues a visa to a Russian tourist, well, then in many cases they have to transit through Lithuania or Poland or Finland in order to get into the Schengen zone. And so what some of those countries are starting to suggest is that you can issue as many visas as you want in other parts of the EU, but ultimately it will be our border guards that decide whether those Russian tourists can come over the border and enter the bloc. Now, normally under the Schengen Agreement, they should be allowed in, but on national security grounds, a border guard can turn Russian tourists around, or any tourists really, but in this case, Russian tourists. And what those Eastern European countries are starting to suggest is that they are going to not just be asking a lot more questions of Russian tourists if they do rock up to the border with a visa to get in, but they will increasingly be turning them around because in their view it is a national security threat to be having many Russians coming into their country given what has happened in Ukraine.
Trent Murray in Budapest, thank you.
Marie Dumoulin is director of the Wider Europe programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I asked her about the divisions within the bloc.
There are 2 main sides to the argument. The first one is a moral one. They say it's morally awkward to see Russian tourists in the streets of European cities while Russia is waging a war in Ukraine. So that's the first side of the argument. The second one is a political one. They say people traveling to the EU are mostly upper middle classes, people that can have some influence over decision-making in the Kremlin, or at least people the Kremlin would listen to. And so by creating a dissatisfaction among these people because they can't go to the EU anymore, it will lead them to exert some pressure over the Kremlin to influence the further decisions on the war. The second concern is that the argument about a possible influence on decision-making from the people that would suffer from this visa ban is seen as wishful thinking. There's a very low proportion of the Russian population which travels abroad. It's less than a third of the population. And most of the people who travel do not travel to EU countries. So it would in no way be a significant amount of people who would protest this decision. And it's probably not the people the Kremlin listens to. So the influence of such a decision on Russian decision-making is not proven.
So you talked about the isolation of Russian society. Is there a danger in that long term, do you think?
Well, Russia will not be forever the Russia we have now. So if the EU wants to have some influence on the future of this society, it needs to keep at least some level of engagement with the society. It's difficult to have engagement with the authorities now, but at least you can hope that for the future, if you remain in contact with people in Russia, you may have some influence over their thinking, or at least they will know how the EU works, and they will know what is right and what is wrong in the Russian authorities' narrative about Europe. The discussion is about a visa ban for tourists, but there is no such thing as a tourism visa for the EU. It's either for short stays or long stays. So if you ban all visas for short stays in the EU, it means that people who have family in the EU or who want to travel for a conference or for some business with EU corporations will not be able to do that. So it may have very heavy consequences for particular individuals who happen to be the individuals with the most serious links to EU countries. So we are basically striking the people who are closer to us, which is kind of also morally difficult.
Iraq's Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi has warned he'll resign if the political chaos in Baghdad continues. At least 23 people have been killed in clashes between security forces and supporters of influential Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. Violence erupted this week after Sadr said he was withdrawing from politics. It follows 10 months of political deadlock, the longest Iraq has gone without a government.
Britain's monarch, Queen Elizabeth, will break from tradition to appoint the next UK Prime Minister at her Scottish home in Balmoral, instead of at Buckingham Palace, due to mobility issues. The 96-year-old will meet outgoing leader Boris Johnson before appointing his successor, heavily tipped to be Liz Truss, who will be revealed next week after a vote by ruling Conservative Party members.
At least 10 people have been killed in Indonesia after a truck crashed into a bus stop outside a school. Most of the victims were students who were waiting for buses after class. Police say around 20 children were injured and taken to hospital. The truck driver's been detained.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come, a letter from the President. A British woman receives a message from China's Xi Jinping after an act of bravery decades ago.
Soaring energy prices, surging inflation, strained supply chains. As costs spiral and goods run short, people are feeling the heat. Join us for a special new series, Crunch Time, starting August the 1st, here on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Global aid has started arriving in Pakistan after unusually heavy monsoon rains triggered floods that submerged a third of the country and killed more than 1,100 people.
The United Nations has appealed for $160 million to help with what it calls an unprecedented climate catastrophe. Our correspondent Daniel Khan reports.
Well, I've just reached the province of Sindh, and what I have seen here is something I've not seen before. I've covered and reported the 2010 floods in Pakistan, but this is something else. According to some conservative estimates, this is 3 times bigger than 2010. Climate experts say Pakistan has received nearly 190% more rain than the 30-year average. So far, 1,160 people, including 380 children, have been killed, over 1,500 injured. In Sindh, where I am at the moment, this province has been hit the hardest. Standing crop on thousands of acres of land has been completely destroyed. The floodwater seems to be like a sea, and the bad news is that it is not over yet. We have reports that heavy flooding is traveling from the north and will reach Sindh in a day or two. Emergency has been declared across the province. We know the whole country has come together to help. Foreign aid has also started to arrive. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is visiting almost every flood-hit area, announcing relief packages, but it is very slow. We know that a third of the country is underwater and 33 million people have been affected. On my way, I saw trucks coming from the province of Punjab carrying relief goods traveling to Sindh, but this needs to be tackled in a systematic way.
Daniel Khan reporting there from Sindh province in Pakistan.
A state of emergency has been declared in Jackson in Mississippi after the US city's water treatment plant broke down. It was inundated by flooding, leaving residents and businesses without access to clean water. Officials are distributing drinking water along with water for toilets. Schools, restaurants and businesses have been forced to close. The state governor said the problem may last for some time.
Extreme summer temperatures and drought in southern England are proving detrimental for trees. Many are already shedding heat-damaged leaves, creating a so-called false autumn. Our correspondent Kitty Logan visited a Christmas tree farm.
This field was planted with tiny Christmas trees in March, but many haven't survived the drought and scorching summer sun.
And they literally burnt the tree, and this is what's happened there.
Andrew Ingram has been growing fir trees for over 50 years. He says he's never seen anything like this.
There's a bit of green in there, that's not completely dead. But if we look at these buds on the end, there's no life in there at all. I'm afraid that's dead.
Even regular watering couldn't save them. And if temperatures continue to rise, growing these trees in southern England could prove tricky.
Well, the extent of the loss is, we think, about 25 to 30%, and we planted 11,000 trees here. So we think the loss is about 2,500 to 3,000 trees.
Trees all over the south of England have struggled in the heat, some more than others, depending on soil type and species. Burnt leaves are a clear sign of heat damage. So are the piles of leaves in August.
It's far too early in the year for leaves to be on the ground like this. It's a sign that trees are stressed by the drought. It means that the roots can't pull enough water out of the soil, so the tree drops its leaves to try to retain the little bit of moisture it has.
Without leaves, trees no longer absorb carbon dioxide, losing a vital tool in the fight against climate change. The cool shade is gone too, exposing the earth below to even more heat, disrupting nature and warming cities.
Everyone forgets that trees cool the urban environment, not only through shade, but through their respiration. When they respirate, they are then cooling the air.
The heat also brought out berries early, but they'll be gone sooner, threatening birds and small animals which depend on them in winter. And if droughts occur more often in future, there could be changes for tree species too.
A general slowing of woodland growth, I think, in the summers, and narrower tree rings. We might lose some species in the medium term. In the longer term, if we get these very dry summers, then a number of the more damp demanding species will be lost.
Better water management might help, and researchers at Kew Gardens aim to identify trees which could cope with drought.
Knowledge is being gained very quickly now in what trees are going to be suitable to this changing climate. And then we can start looking at these provenances. So look at seed provenance and how we can build that in to do species selection for drought.
While not all these trees would survive a changing climate, others may flourish. So in years to come, all this could look very different. Kitty Logan, CGTN, Oxfordshire.
British woman has received an unexpected letter direct from China's President Xi Jinping. Denise Wynne wrote to Beijing to say thanks for the bravery of Chinese fishermen who rescued her father in World War II. And as our correspondent Luo Chen reports, Denise got a surprising response back.
A diplomatic visit with a very special message. Marking an act of heroism in World War II that's a symbol of UK-China cooperation.
Thank you.
80 years ago, Denise Wynne's father, Dennis, was one of more than 1,800 British prisoners of war being taken from Hong Kong to labor camps in Japan. They were packed into the hold of cargo ship the Lisbon Morrow when a U.S. torpedo struck it off the coast of China. Despite the danger, a group of local Chinese people came to the rescue, helping save her dad.
He said that if the Chinese fishermen hadn't come, that, there would have been more carnage, that there would have been more prisoner of war shot and killed, and that he owes his life. He owed his life to the Chinese fishermen, and that he wouldn't have been alive and survived the years that he did, and he wouldn't have had me, he wouldn't have had my grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
More than 800 prisoners of war died in incidents off the Zhoushan Island, around 100 miles from Shanghai's coast. But the fishermen's bravery saved almost 400 others. Denise wrote to China's President Xi Jinping this month to thank the locals for their heroism.
Dear Mrs. Wynne, it is my great pleasure to have received your letter. The touching story of heroic fishermen from Zhoushan, Zhejiang, coming to the rescue of British prisoners of war on board the Lisbon Morrow in 1942.
Little did she know she'd get a personal reply from the Chinese leader.
No, never, never. I just thought perhaps it would be put to one side and not read, but I'm just so appreciative that he did take the time to read it and to reply. This is such an honour.
50 years after establishing diplomatic ties, UK-China relations are near an all-time low. The country's top diplomats in Britain hand-delivered the letter, hoping it helps to promote understanding.
Thank you.
This story, which took place in 1942, is very touching. It's a testimony to this friendship and mutual support between the people of China and the people of the UK during the Second World War.
Denise hopes to visit Zhoushan one day to see a memorial being erected to commemorate the fishermen. But as this unexpected visit to her home in the rural parts of England shows, the impact of their heroics that day still lives on. Luo Chen, CGTN, London.
Spanish crowds were left red-faced after the annual food fight in Buñol. Thousands of revellers crowded into the city centre to throw tomatoes at each other. The tradition, known as the Tomatina Festival, dates back to the 1940s, and after a 2-year hiatus, some were delighted to catch up and find a plum target. Whether it's tomato or tomato, when you're having this much fun, it's unlikely anyone is going to call the whole thing off.
Very tasty. Our top stories again. Russia's Gazprom halts gas deliveries to Europe at short notice, claiming more maintenance is needed on the Nord Stream pipeline.
Counting the costs, Eurozone inflation sets a new high as record energy costs drive up prices.
And one of the most influential political figures of the 20th century. Tributes are paid to Mikhail Gorbachev, who's died aged 91.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK on Preview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.